note I saw this morning said, "Loving, please introduce yourself to my Facebook friends." From my Midwest friend, Craig. Like everything about me, I'll have to acknowledge that my response to that will have to seem strange to most. As in, not normal, not of the norm, not truly of the status quo. Because to me, now at the atomic level in me, is the perception we are the city in Hunger Games. We are the people of the city in the Hunger Games. We are the creatures screwed in by the millions, I guess, or billions, into the matrix, making of ourselves little more than batteries or motive power to the matrix. What I'm saying is not words to be nasty, or cynical, or self-righteous, any more than Morpheus was trying to be nasty or cynical or hurtful. For whatever reasons, Morpheus got outside the matrix and could see. Almost anyone really getting outside the matrix would see. I was born both inside and outside the matrix, deep inside the matrix, into its control center in one of the wealthiest, most influential towns in the world, a suburb of New York City, uber wealthy suburb of New York City. And to a dad who sold his services to those people as a esteemed music teacher, piano teacher of they and their kids. But he was the son of a fireman who tried to make additional money as a jeweler, making jewelry. Dad never became of them, although he was highly regarded by them. And I never became of them, so I was, although my behavior for decades would certainly suggest different, but I see us exactly as the people of the city in Hunger Games. Exactly. And maybe you look at those people and don't think there's a problem. I suspect you do. I don't suspect that as you look and say, we are those people. I am, or I was most of my life, those people. That is how I see it. And I'm trying to deal with that specifically to try and become what Neo and Morpheus never figured out how to become, a way for others out of the matrix. They could free them physically. They couldn't free them psychologically. I'm using my body, my nervous system, whatever talents I have, to try and morph into an antidote. And whereas I have no illusions I'm going to succeed, I have near certainty that I see the direction. I see the outlines of the solution. And I'm simply trying to move as fast as I can to become as much of the antidote as possible. I think about what I'm about to say rarely, but I do think of it from time to time. I know little about the hermits of, is it the Middle Ages or the pre-Middle Ages? The Dark Ages, I guess. People that later generations, later centuries would look at as quite moral people, particularly moral people, that withdrew totally from society into desert areas or caves. And some of them, maybe most of them, withdrew because they had some sense that they had a level of health, human health, which could be understood as morality, that they needed to nurture and they needed to protect so that it could be available to future generations in some form, in their writing, in their example, whatever. I'm much that kind of creature. No credit or discredit to me. I'm much that kind of creature as I experience myself. Among other things, I'm a serious scholar, a serious student, in the way a good scientist would be. What I know as much as anything is how much I am not that solution yet, how much I don't know. In the last 3 weeks, I've probably read 5, 6, 8, 10 scholarly books in psychology, in women's suffrage, the South American anti-apartheid movement, biblical scholarship, particularly New Testament, Albert Schweitzer, not your New York Times bestsellers, not your fiction books. I experience myself, whether I'm a good version or a bad version, as a scientist, except I'm not called to cure cancer. I'm called to cure the pathology that we have as that city in Hunger Games, as the people of that city in Hunger Games. I'm called to figure out what that solution is, and I know it has to be with a different way of being. And the nature of the problem is to not invent a whole new idea about a way of being, but to refine what people throughout history that have been similarly called, to refine the work, to refine the serum, if you will, that they have been slowly, ever so slowly, moving toward. Jesus moved in the direction of the serum that is the cure. He was constrained by the limits of knowledge in his day, whereas we are unconstrained to the extent of 2,000 years since in the march of humankind's understanding of things. In some respects, that march has taken us away from the truth, but in many respects it's given us elements that Jesus certainly didn't have available. And the serum that Jesus was onto was loving, the human capacity for loving, unconditional love, agape, not lusting, which is 99.9999% of what we mean by loving. He was onto that serum, but he was hugely constrained by the lack of knowledge we now have 2,000 years later. Of course he thought it had to do with a deity. Of course he thought that by unleashing agape in himself and in others, that it would become the sign to a sentient God, for that God to then bring about a different world on earth, a different way of being. In the same way, intelligent people thousands of years ago thought that a flame was a god, was an animate creature. It wasn't stupidity. They were constrained by what they knew. Well, I'm sure I see that what Jesus was onto was simply the human capacity for loving. As was Gandhi, as was King, as was King and Gandhi's teacher, Leo Tolstoy, as were the great activists, and on and on and on, all the people that I study. But somehow they didn't see what I believe is, what I'm certain is the simple truth. They were on the periphery, but they never got to it. And the simple truth is, the most gratifying way to be a human being is to operate out of and with the part of our nervous system in charge that is agape, that is loving, that is other-centeredness. It's a capacity of our nervous system, tightly intertwined with compassion and empathy. It's so simple, it's so obvious, that makes it one of the difficult things to present as the cure. No, we know about love, we know about loving. No, that's not it. We've tried it. No, actually you haven't. You've tried lusting. I didn't say lusting was bad, but lusting is things that are about me, including, oh, I love how she makes me feel, or how he makes me feel. That's a different neurological capacity than I just ran into a building fire at the risk of my life to save a child. I didn't do that because that was about me. I did that because that was about the connection that I experienced to that child that would have died otherwise. I constantly hurl myself into the abyss, into the darkness. I constantly hurl myself in the direction that I know the answer lies, so that as I get into the darkness, my eyes can adjust and I can learn a bit more. By way of analogy, I'm a Lewis and Clark. I don't know the history of these guys. I think they were in their early 60s, oddly enough. I did do a little bit of reading a while ago. I may be recalling incorrectly. 50s anyway. They were not young kids, as I recall. I don't know, but I bet some people, when Lewis and Clark came back, said, "You wasted your time, guys. What you're describing here, no paths, some maps no one could read. No one's going to follow you. No one's going to go out there." But of course now we have California. What they came back with certainly was not enough for the masses to follow them, but it was enough for someone to follow them. And they came back with a little more evidence and a little more clarity. And then someone else followed. That's how it works. Well, in that sense, I'm way bleeding edge. That's what I'm called to do. It's what I've been called to do my entire adulthood. I am not for the masses. Lewis and Clark were not for the masses. What they pioneered wound up being for the masses. They weren't. Their piece of it wasn't. I'm what's the type of research that's done? Is it fundamental research? Where there's no idea, no one has a clue what kind of product the research will ever turn into. But if it's not done, then years and decades afterwards, there will not be revolutionary discoveries. No one knows perfect truth. At least any scientist worth their thought knows that into their bones. But they do sense that they can move toward fundamentally useful new approximations of the truth. And I experience myself as being on the cusp of clarifying not the cure for cancer, which I have, by the way. Cancer, I have. But the cure for war, ecocide, famine, the cure for the psychological ailments that, in the absence of that cure, make us the most drugged, self-drugged via pharmaceuticals population that there's ever been on the planet, the most suicidal population I think there's ever been, the most imprisoned population that's ever been. I'm on the cusp of the basic research, of breakthroughs on the basic research of that. Now, I've actually done for myself the breakthrough. I know it's loving. I know it is making that one's entire being, inhabiting that relatively small part of the nervous system and doing everything from there. So I'm not on the cusp of that. I know that's the answer. Everyone that I regard throughout history points in that direction, whether they knew it or not. What I don't know is how to make it manifest in a way that that second person follows Lewis and Clark out to California, and then the third, and then the sixth, and then the 12th, and then the 24th. That's what I'm desperately trying to become, to write, to study. I learned last Thursday that there's a significant chance, it's now unlikely that I will die this year of the cancer in my liver. They've determined that miraculously it has not spread so much in the last 4 months that it's become unoperable. It is still operable. So I'm going to accept from Medicaid, and therefore from our children, from society, I'm going to accept $30,000 worth of chemo treatment, 2 months, and then rest for 3 weeks, and then go into an operation that will have me hospitalized for 10 days or 2 weeks when they attempt to cut out the 2 tumors in my liver. Every moment that I'm not debilitated by the chemo or the operation or the drugs, I'll be in study. I've harvested dozens of new books at Library of Congress that I can study on my computer in the various books in the various avenues that I've earlier discussed: psychology, ancient morality, addiction, science, the most current psychology and evolutionary biology on human morality, religion, the history of Jesus, who is the most powerful catalyst for people like Gandhi and King and Tolstoy, that Teresa of Calcutta, Oscar Romero, the liberation theologists in South America, the most humanizing change agents we've ever seen. Jesus was the catalyst for them, the man Jesus. So books on the scholarship of who was the early Jesus, who were the early Christians, there's a 40% chance I'll have another 10 or 12 or 15 years to work on this, that they'll be able to cure the cancer. There's a 60% chance that I won't see 5 years from now. But I'm going to take that option. Too much of society's money, of our children's money, has been poured into making me a capable instrument for them in this area that I've just discussed, the most important area, far more important than the discovery of cancer. The psychological cancer, the cure to the psychological cancer that's killing us. Too much money to glibly throw that away. And if for $100,000, $120,000, $150,000 they can cure me, I figure that's $10,000 a year that I can pay back through my donated service to society, to our children, to our grandchildren that I've taken it from. I have reason to think that I have the aptitudes I've spoken of, because in a much less healthy pursuit, but in a much more one where you get much more concrete feedback. I was an executive in the computer industry, turning around failing organizations for 25 years, having success that not 1 in a million people could have. Not to parcel up companies like a Gordon Gekko, but to save people's jobs and careers and business relationships. A high-stakes accelerated change agent. That's what I've done, practiced, studied my whole life. Now I'm applying it to what matters. If you Google Start Loving, what comes up is my primary blog by that name as the first listing. And I continue as a joyful duty to put there everything that I'm learning in my journey to make it available to others. The same way I presume that Lewis and Clark made their notes and diaries available upon their return, that others could piece together the next part of the solution.